الحمد لله وكفى والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد. Respected listeners, today we completed a number of surahs. First of all, we completed Surah Al-Ankabut, which we started yesterday. Surah Al-Ankabut is a Meccan surah, which it means the spider. In the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first of all speaks about how people have always been tested because of their faith, and because of their faith people will continue to be tested. Then Allah speaks about those who do good and who pass in their test, those who don't. Allah mentions those who complain of Allah's tests, but Allah says that He will most surely come to know those who are sincere in their faith and those who are hypocrites. Allah then speaks about the Prophet Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam, and then the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, and then the Prophet Lut alayhi salatu wasalam, Sayyidina Ishaq, Sayyidina Yaqub, Sayyidina Shu'aib, the people of Ad and Thamud, i.e. the Prophet Sayyidina Hud and Sayyidina Salih. Allah also speaks about Qarun and Fir'aun and Haman. Allah mentions Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. In this way Allah mentions a few prophets, but not in much detail, just in a very summary fashion. Allah then mentions how different nations perished and different nations were destroyed in different ways because of their sin of rejecting the Prophet ﷺ. Some were killed by a shower of stones and rocks. Others were seized by a sudden scream. Others were thrust into the ground. Others were drowned. Allah says, and Allah was not unjust to them, rather they were unjust to themselves. Allah then mentions an example, a parable. Allah says a parable of those who have taken gods besides Allah is that of a spider that spins a web. Verily, the weakest of all homes or structures is the web of a spider. If only these people knew. That's it. That's the only verse that speaks about the web of a spider. And the whole surah has been named after this Al-Ankabut spider. Allah mentions this is related to shirk, and what it means is that if someone studies a web, it's very appealing, very attractive, very complex, and it seems to be a very sturdy structure, and it requires a lot of effort, great expertise to spin such a web. And undoubtedly the spider spends a lot of time creating this structure. It looks so elaborate and intricate. Yet, if someone just blows at the web once, or someone just swipes it once with the hand, then it crumbles and it disappears. And such a magnificent, apparently magnificent and complex structure is destroyed in an instant. So what it is that despite its appearance, in essence it is very flimsy, weak, and it cannot stand. Now, the reality of shirk is the same. That all the methods and the whole mechanism and machinery of kufr and shirk may seem to be very elaborate, well structured, very complex and intricate, and it may have taken so long to spin and to set up, yet despite its appearance it inherently is very weak, and it can collapse in an instant in the face of haqq, in the face of truth, in the face of tawheed. All the ways of the mushrikeen, their beliefs, their customs, their traditions, their ways, the whole structure and power. There's so much that can be said about this one verse alone and this example of the web being the weakest of structures. I mentioned this time and time again that the World Wide Web is no different. The internet seems to mark the most prominent achievement, or one of the most prominent achievements of recent times, and so much now depends on the internet, on the World Wide Web. Yet I'm not speaking mainly about the web, I'm just saying that it's a very similar example, that it's so elaborate, so complex, so intricate, yet inherently it's so weak, that in an instant the whole system can be brought down. And what would be the result? The results could be disastrous. And I'll give you an example. I'm not sure if any of you are actually aware of this. Only yesterday I was reading an IT news magazine. In there was a very detailed report of how the main servers of the internet, there are 13 in total, there are 13 servers that actually serve as the backbone and the bedrock of the entire world internet system. And these servers were hacked, and about 4 of them were brought down. Now the remaining 9 continued to operate because the engineers quickly discovered the problem and began repairing it. But had the hackers successfully hacked most of these 13 servers that serve as the bedrock and the backbone of the entire internet, the whole internet system would have collapsed for the first time in history. It's never happened before. For the first time in history, the whole internet system would have collapsed. Everything. And this wasn't just a question of people not being able to retrieve their emails. Their predictions were that catastrophic. That it would result in so many emergencies and disasters. And funnily enough, they won't have lifts with the number 13 on them. They won't have a floor numbered 13 in their skyscrapers. Yeah. But just like there are 13 feathers in the claw of the eagle on the dollar, and there are 13 steps on the pyramid on the dollar, and there are 13 stars and 13 feathers and 13 this and 13 that on the logo and the emblem of the President of the United States, and on the dollar cheekily saying, "In God we trust." They won't have the number 13 because they believe it to be evil, they believe it to bring bad luck. Yet again, for some strange reason, not 12 and not 14, they've chosen to have 13 servers to act as the bedrock and the backbone of the entire internet system. Verily, the weakest of structures is the web of a spider. The remaining surah contains topics that are famous in the Meccan surahs, the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His creation. Allah's mentioning the mushrikeen, and also the Day of Judgment and the reality of the worldly life. We then read Surah Al-Rum. Surah Al-Rum means the Romans. This is another Meccan surah. Towards the beginning and middle of the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the signs in His creation, many varied signs. Allah also strikes examples of shirk and tawheed, similar to the web of a spider example. Allah encourages believers to spend in the way of Allah, and talking about spending, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, whatever interest or usury that you give so that this may increase the wealth of people, this does not increase anything in the sight of Allah. But whatever zakah you give, charity, seeking Allah's pleasure, then these are the ones who actually increase their wealth. Allah speaks about how discord, strife and corruption has appeared upon the earth, upon the land and the sea as a result of mankind's sins. Allah speaks about the believers, and in comparison to them, disbelievers, Allah mentions further signs of His creation. Allah explains towards the end of the surah how He has struck every kind of parable and example in the Qur'an for mankind. But still people will not believe. It's because Allah has sealed their hearts, and the surah ends with a final verse in which Allah Azza wa Jalla speaks to the Prophet ﷺ, encouraging him to remain patient and perseverance, for the promise of Allah is true. Now the surah has been named Surah Al-Rum, the Romans, because of the beginning few verses. These few verses actually refer to a few events. In the Qur'an, certain things are mentioned that people often find strange. They don't find strange, but it's a kind of revelation to them that we didn't know. The city of Babylon is mentioned in the Qur'an, Bibabil, in Surah Al-Baqarah. The Romans are mentioned, as in this surah. And because the Romans weren't necessarily recognized as a religious group like the Christians or the Jews. It's just, of course, the Romans were Christians predominantly, but still, the Romans are mentioned in the Qur'an. People think, well, why is the whole surah named after the Romans? It's just because of these a few verses in the beginning. The story is that in the very beginning of Islam, when the Prophet ﷺ first began to preach his message, the Prophet ﷺ concentrated only on tawheed and the eradication of shirk, encouraging the believers to believe in Allah and in the final day, in the hereafter, etc. Laws had not been revealed, and there was no social structure for the Muslims to abide by. And the verses of the Qur'an were also mainly about belief in the fire, in paradise, in the hereafter, in life after death, in the day of reckoning, in the oneness of Allah, in the evil and abomination of shirk, etc. Now, because of these general principles, the Muslims themselves believe that they were very close to the Christians as well as the Jews. And the mushrikeen, the pagan Arabs, also believed this. That although because there wasn't much detail in Islam at that time, in general the principles were very similar. Similar to the Jews and the Christians, the Muslims believed in a tradition of books, in a revelation from Allah, in one supreme God, in belief. They believed in life after death. They believed in the concept of paradise and hell, and of the resurrection, etc., etc. None of these beliefs were ever shared by the pagan Arabs. Now, the pagan Arabs felt closer in religion to the other pagans of the time, including the Zoroastrians, the Persians, because they were fire worshippers and they believed in the religion of Zoroastrianism. And they didn't believe in any history of prophets or holy scriptures, not necessarily from Allah anyway. They didn't believe in one supreme God. Rather, their beliefs were very similar to the pagan Arabs, though they may have differed in some aspects. Shirk, they were polytheists. Now, during those days, especially when the Prophet ﷺ had began preaching the message in Mecca, to the extreme north, a great war was raging for many, many years between the two empires of the time, the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. These were the two superpowers of the time, huge armies. The Persians controlled much of the east, and the Romans controlled much of the northern western Middle East, and obviously other parts of Europe as well. Southern Europe, etc. These were the two mightiest powers of the time, Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And they were always fighting with one another. The wars lasted for many, many decades. And at times the Romans would gain a foothold over the Persians. At times the Persians would defeat the Romans in certain battles. We're not talking about one particular battle, we're talking about an overall period of war. Now, on one certain occasion, the Persians scored a great victory over the Romans, and this was quite a decisive victory. Battles would always rage here and there, but this was quite a decisive victory. And on that occasion, the Persians actually managed to reach Jerusalem, which was a religious capital of the Byzantine Roman Empire. And they desecrated the churches, they took away the main cross, which the people believed Jesus was crucified on, ma'adallah. But they desecrated the churches, they demolished many of the shrines, and they ransacked Jerusalem. And they occupied it. And the Romans were driven from Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. And for them that was a humiliating defeat. It was very symbolic as well. So the pagan Arabs used to take great interest in the affairs of the Persians versus the Romans. And on that particular occasion, the pagans began taunting the Muslims and saying to them that the Persians are our brothers in faith. We both worship false gods and idols, and we don't believe in the things that you believe in. And the Christians are your brothers in faith, because you believe in very similar things. If your God and your religion and your ways were true, then why would your God allow your brethren in faith to be defeated by our brethren? So this just shows that our way of polytheism and our religion of paganism, along with the paganism of the Persians, this is the truth, and you're on falsehood. Now the Muslims felt very hurt and grieved by this, but at that time they couldn't say anything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed these verses of the Qur'an in which Allah Azza wa Jalla says, Alif Lam Mim, the Romans have been defeated in a land close by, in Jerusalem, and they, after their defeat, shall soon triumph. In a few years, to Allah belongs a matter both before and after, and on that day the believers shall rejoice. Through the assistance of Allah, Allah assists whom He wishes, for He is Almighty, All Merciful. This is a promise of Allah. Allah does not fail in His promise. But most people do not know. They only know the apparent nature of the worldly life, and they are negligent of the hereafter. Now, when the Muslims received this verse, they were quite happy. But the mushrikeen began taunting the Muslims, saying, a few weeks, a few months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, a good few years passed, and the Romans were still retreating. And the Muslims again couldn't answer, but they believed that Allah said in a few years' time. And that's exactly what happened. In a few years, many ulama say, after the Prophet ﷺ emigrated to Medina, then some ulama say that this major battle won by the Romans against the Persians, that finally, which was a watershed, and finally again turned the tide against the Persians in favour of the Romans in this long-going war. This battle, this decisive battle, took place on the day of Badr. So here to the south, the Muslims defeated the mushrikeen, and there to the north, by the promise of Allah, the Romans scored a decisive defeat against Persians, which turned the tide against them. So this is the main story, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to it here. This is why the whole surah has been called Surah Al-Rum. We then read Surah Luqman. Surah Luqman again is a Meccan surah. In the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions signs of His creation, signs of His creation, as well as Allah praises the believers and Allah disparages the disbelievers. Then Allah mentions the advice of Luqman alayhi salatu wasalam to his son. Luqman alayhi salatu wasalam was a very wise man from the nations of before. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had bestowed much wisdom. Allah had endowed him with much wisdom, and he advised his son with a few pearls of advice, and Allah quotes them here, namely that be grateful. And Allah says, and remember, and we gave Luqman wisdom, saying to him, be grateful to Allah, for whoever is grateful, he's only grateful for the good of his own soul. Whoever is ungrateful, then Allah is more independent, full of praise. And remember when Luqman was telling his son and advising him, oh child, do not commit shirk. He then speaks about the parents. But if the parents compel you to do something which is contrary to Allah's command, then despite your respect and love for them, do not disobey Allah in the obedience of His creation. O my son, even if it is something to the measure of a mustard seed, and then it be in a rock, or in the heavens and the earth, Allah will produce it. O son, establish salah, enjoin the good, forbid the evil, be patient over that which befalls you. Do not turn your cheek away from mankind, and do not walk arrogantly and proudly upon the earth. Verily Allah does not like every proud, arrogant person. Be moderate in your walk, and lower your speech. Soften and lower your speech, lower your voice. Verily the most detested of all sounds is the braying of a donkey. So one of the words of advice is that, look, lower your voice, i.e. reduce the volume. Control your tongue. And only speak when absolutely needed. Otherwise, Allah likens the speech and the constant talking and raising of one's voice to the braying of a donkey. It's like a donkey brays and makes noise, horrendous, horrible sound. Doesn't bring any comfort whatsoever to anyone. It's a pain on the ears, real torture. And Allah says that it's the worst of all sounds. So Allah likens the excessive speech and the constant raising of one's voice to the braying of a donkey. We should ask ourselves, how often do I act like a donkey? Truly. In simple words, keep your gob shut. وَغْضُضْ مِنْ صَوْتِكَ. A nice way of saying it is lower your voice and control your tongue and refine your speech and be careful of what you say, etc., etc., etc. Some people just don't understand that. Another way of saying to look, keep your mouth shut. Okay? Speak only when you have to. And even then, weigh your words and be careful of what you say. We don't. The truth is, we commit more sins with the tongue than with any other part of the body. It's easy to abstain from alcohol and from adultery and from theft. But it's not easy at all to commit the sin of backbiting, of slander, of abuse, of saying things with one's tongue, of lying, etc. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. I was explaining in the Urdu speech that there are many beautiful hadeeth about controlling one's tongue, and I've spoken on this topic at length before. Just one of them is that Imam Tirmidhi rahmatullah relates hadith in the Sunan. Sayyidina Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiyallahu ta'ala anhu was once travelling with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he asked him about any deed. Tell me, Ya Rasulullah, of a deed that will take me closer to Jannah and enter me into Jannah, and that will save me from the fire. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Mu'adh, verily you have asked for a great thing, but Allah makes it easy for whomever He wills. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam advised Sayyidina Mu'adh radiyallahu anhu about a number of things, about salah, about faith, about Islam, about jihad, about tahajjud, about fasting. And then he went on to explain to him that, Mu'adh, should I not tell you something which encompasses all of this? Mu'adh radiyallahu anhu said, of course, Ya Rasulullah. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with his own noble fingers pulled at his tongue and said, control your tongue. Sayyidina Mu'adh radiyallahu anhu said, Ya Rasulullah, will we be taken to task for what our tongues utter? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Mu'adh, I thought you were intelligent. In one narration it says, I thought you were intelligent. Mu'adh, there is nothing else other than the harvest that people reap with their tongues that flings them flat onto their faces in the fire of Jahannam. There is nothing else. If anything flings people flat onto their faces in the fire of Jahannam, it is the harvest that they reap with their tongues. Prophet ﷺ calls it a harvest. Why? Because when a farmer reaps a harvest, see, at that particular moment, he doesn't distinguish between good and bad, corrupt and suitable, wet and dry. See, at that moment he's just reaping the harvest, just bringing everything in. The sorting out, the filtering can all be done afterwards. So in the process, he will bring in wet and dry vegetables or fruits. He will bring in the good and the bad produce. He will bring in produce which is fresh and healthy to eat, and he will also bring in produce or fruits or vegetables or crops that are so corrupt that they're covered in maggots and covered in filth and eaten away by insects. See, at that particular moment, this is what you call the harvest. You bring everything in: dry, wet, good, bad, suitable, unsuitable, corrupt, etc. So this is why the Prophet ﷺ calls the speech of man that flings him into the fire the harvest that he reaps with his tongue. Because when he does so, it's like his tongue just pulls in everything: good, bad, sin, piety, that which is corrupt. And undoubtedly, in most people's cases, that which is corrupt and sinful outnumbers by far that which is good and suitable. This is the harvest of our tongues. That's how the Prophet ﷺ describes it. Allah then speaks about signs in His creation and other things as well. Then we read Surah Al-Sajdah. This is the famous surah that one should recite every night. The sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to recite Surah Al-Sajdah and Surah Al-Mulk after Maghrib Salah at night. In the surah, Allah mentions some of the signs of His creation: followed by verses of His mighty nature, of His majesty, etc. Allah speaks of the Day of Judgment, how the sinful will stand before Allah, and in comparison to them, how the believers shall be rewarded. This is where we have the verse of Sajdah. Allah also speaks briefly about about Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam and some of the prophets of Banu Israel, and then Allah speaks generally about how the former nations perished and were destroyed. Then the surah ends with the promise of Allah, and with the mention of the Day of Judgment, and also it's one of Allah's signs in His creation. We then read Surah Al-Ahzab partly. Surah Al-Ahzab is a long surah, and not that long, but longer than the others. And we read half of it today, the other half we will complete tomorrow, inshallah. With this, we have reached the third part of the Holy Qur'an now. Out of the 30 parts, we've completed the 21st part today. Half of Surah Al-Ahzab was read, the other half we shall complete tomorrow. Surah Al-Ahzab is a Madani surah. I've spoken on it in detail before. Tafsir is available. In the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about some superstitious beliefs, about some commands regarding adopted children, fostered children, etc. Allah mentions how the believers should treat the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as more dear to themselves than their own souls, how his wives are their mothers, etc. Allah then speaks about the battle, or not the battle, but the campaign of the trench in quite a number of verses. This is the last topic of today. Those of you who are interested in listening to the detailed tafsir should obtain a copy of the recording of the tafsir when I did it some time ago. Very briefly, in the 5th year of Hijrah, the Mushrikeen of Mecca led an army of approximately 13,000 soldiers, gathered from all parts of Arabia, under their leadership, but on the instigation of the Jews of Medina and of Khaybar. They marched towards Medina with the intention of finally destroying Islam once and for all and putting a stop to this movement. They surrounded the city, and the intention was to starve the Muslims and then to launch an attack on the city. Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum remained within the city, defending it from within. As part of their defences, Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum to dig a trench that protected the northeastern part of the city. The other parts of the city were protected by natural barriers. That's where the Mushrikeen were also, towards the northeast of the city. They felt that that was where the defences could be breached. The siege of Medina in this particular campaign lasted many days, almost a month. And during that time, no battle took place. There were skirmishes over the trench, and approximately 6 Sahaba radiyallahu ta'ala anhum passed away and were martyred in this battle. However, finally, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sowed discord and disagreement between the different factions, because the factions had come from various parts of Arabia, and that's why Al-Ahzab means the factions, and this is the name of the whole surah. And the battle or the campaign is known as the campaign of the trench or the campaign of the factions. So Allah Azza wa Jalla sowed discord and disagreement and conflict in between the factions themselves, and eventually they began disagreeing. It was winter, it was bitterly cold, so they despaired and they became frustrated. And then finally, without any battle, miraculously, after a strong gust of wind on one particular night, the entire army just dispersed. And one day the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum woke up in the morning and they looked across the trench, and lo and behold, on the other side of the trench, on the outskirts of the city, where the night before and the day before they had seen the same thousands upon thousands of mushrikeen gathered, waiting to pounce on Medina, the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum woke up the next morning to see that the wind had blown severely, and there were uprooted tents, there were uprooted and overturned cauldrons, and there were blankets and other things, weapons and other goods and items lying around, scattered all over the plain just outside Medina, but there wasn't a single mushrik to be seen, even though the night before and the day before there were almost 13,000. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to in Surah Al-Ahzab. Allah Azza wa Jalla says that Allah repelled the disbelievers with their anger in them. They did not find any good, and Allah was sufficient for the believers in battle, and Allah is almighty, all powerful. And then once Prophet ﷺ returned to the city, amazing, no battle actually took place, only skirmishes across the trench. When the battle had ended, when this campaign had ended and Prophet ﷺ returned to the city, you see, it may have only seemed like a siege, but it was a very testing time for the believers, because this was the largest army that had ever been assembled in the history of Arabia. The largest army in the history of Arabia. And their motive and their plan was to destroy Islam once and for all. Prophet ﷺ and Sahaba radiyallahu ta'ala anhum felt they couldn't face them outside the city at that time, and they decided to defend the city from within. But there was a threat from within, from two quarters. One, the hypocrites, and two, the Jews. There's one final tribe of Banu Qurayza remaining from the three original tribes of Jewish tribes of Medina. The other two were banished and exiled. This was one last remaining tribe. They had signed a truce and an agreement and a treaty with the Prophet ﷺ that as inhabitants of the city, that it was their duty to defend the city jointly with the Muslims if ever a threat was posed. But right at this critical moment, when it was vital that they support the Muslims and defend the entire city, the Jewish tribe defected to the pagan Arabs. And they betrayed the Muslims at this most critical moment. So they had to be punished. And the story is quite long. The Prophet ﷺ then travelled to their settlement, surrounded it for a number of days, and then eventually they agreed that Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Mu'adh radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, who was the leader of the tribe, the Aus tribe, that was their former ally, they said that we trust him and we hope that he will decide in our favour, and we will make him the arbitrator and our judge, and whatever he decides we will agree to it. They did this on their own initiative, and they did this in the hope that since he was their former ally and a very good friend of many of their leaders, he would plead clemency on their behalf, or he would be very lenient with them, and he would plead with the Prophet ﷺ to treat them exactly as he had treated the former tribes of Banu Nadir and Banu Qaynuqa', in that they were just banished and exiled from Medina, and they were even allowed to take one of them was allowed to take their weapons, the other was told to leave them, but they were allowed to take their goods and their possessions. So Banu Qurayza, after so many acts of betrayal, after so much lying and deception, they still felt that they could get away with it by making Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Mu'adh radiyallahu anhu the judge and arbitrator between them. Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Mu'adh radiyallahu ta'ala, it's a very long story. Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Mu'adh radiyallahu ta'ala basically decided that all their male adults should be killed, and all their children and women should be taken captive, and all their goods and property should be confiscated and distributed amongst the Muslims. And that's exactly what happened. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told him that you have judged with the judgment of Allah from above the seven heavens. And Allah mentions that in the last part of Surah Al-Ahzab that we recited, the part of Surah Al-Ahzab that we recited today. Then the next half is mainly about the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his marriages, his wives, the story of his marriage to Zaynab bint Jahash radiyallahu anha, the mention of Sayyidina Zayd ibn Harithah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, the Prophet ﷺ's rank and standing in the Ummah and in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A lot of that is all contained in Surah Al-Ahzab, the latter part of it that we will recite tomorrow inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to understand. Sallallahu wa sallam ala abdihi wa rasulih Nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.
This lecture was given by Shaykh Abu Yusuf Riyadh al-Haq and has been presented to you by Al-Kawthar Productions. For further information, additional lectures and books, contact us on 0121 773 5191 or alternatively by post at Al-Kawthar Productions, P.O. Box 6008, Birmingham, B100UW, United Kingdom, or visit our website at www.alkawtharacademy.org. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.